I've lived in this town my entire life. One main street, two stoplights, and the kind of place where everyone knows not just your name, but your parents' names and the mistakes you made in high school. I married my wife here, raised my kids here, built a routine so predictable it felt permanent. We've been together for almost 15 years, high school sweethearts who never really left each other's orbit. Marriage came early, kids came soon after, and life settled into something quiet and familiar. From the outside, we were the definition of solid: a modest house, weekend barbecues, school events, shared bills, shared jokes, shared exhaustion. She was my anchor, and I was proud of the life we'd built. My best friend, let's call him Mark, was part of that picture too. He'd been my friend since we were teenagers, practically family. He was at our wedding, at our kids' birthdays, at our dinner table more times than I could count. I trusted both of them completely. Not the blind, naive kind of trust, but the earned kind. The kind that comes from years of showing up, of shared history, of believing that some lines simply don't get crossed. In a town this small, loyalty feels like a survival skill. You grow up thinking betrayal is something that happens elsewhere, to other people, in bigger cities. Looking back now, that belief feels almost childish. The first cracks didn't come with anything dramatic. No lipstick on collars, no secret phone calls I overheard in the middle of the night. It was quieter than that, almost polite. Small shifts I couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore either. My wife started guarding her phone in a way she never had before, not hiding it outright, just turning the screen down when I walked into the room, taking it with her when she went to shower. When I asked her something simple like who she was texting, she'd answer too quickly, like she'd rehearsed it. Just Sarah, or a mom from school, always said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. At the same time, Mark was suddenly everywhere. He'd always been around, sure, but now he seemed woven into our daily life. He'd stop by unannounced, linger longer than usual, laugh a little too hard at my wife's jokes. I told myself I was imagining it. We'd all known each other forever, of course things were comfortable. But there was a moment I couldn't shake. One evening, I came home early from work and found them in the kitchen together. Nothing inappropriate, just standing close, talking quietly. When they noticed me, both of them jumped just a fraction of a second too late, like kids caught doing something they knew they shouldn't be doing. They laughed it off. I laughed too. That's what you do when you don't want to be the paranoid husband in a small town where rumors spread faster than truth. Still, that night, lying in bed next to my wife, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above us, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not jealousy exactly, more like unease, a voice whispering that something had shifted, even if I couldn't yet see what it was. After that, I started noticing things I probably would have dismissed before. Patterns forming where there used to be randomness. My wife began running errands more often, always with vague explanations. Just need to clear my head. Or I forgot a few things at the store. Mark's truck seemed to pass our house a little too frequently, sometimes slowing down, sometimes parked a block away when he said he was just driving around. I hated myself for paying attention to it. Every instinct told me to stop. This was my wife. This was my best friend. People you trust don't become suspects. I kept reminding myself how crazy it sounded, how insulting it would be to even entertain the thought. In a town like ours, an accusation like that doesn't just disappear. It stains everything. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Instead, it grew heavier. Conversations between my wife and me felt thinner, like we were skimming the surface of something deeper we both refused to acknowledge. She seemed distracted, emotionally elsewhere. When I reached for her, sometimes she leaned in, sometimes she pulled away, and I couldn't predict which version of her I'd get. Mark, on the other hand, started acting careful. He avoided looking me in the eye for too long. He asked how I was doing more often, with a concern that felt forced. Once, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're a good man. You know that." It was such a strange thing to say out of nowhere that it stuck with me. I told myself I was spiraling, that stress was playing tricks on my head. Work had been rough. Money was tight. Marriage has seasons. Everyone says that. Not every season feels warm. Still, late at night, when the house was quiet and my thoughts had room to roam, one question kept circling back. If nothing was wrong, why did it feel like everyone was tiptoeing around the truth? The discovery didn't come the way you see in movies. No dramatic reveal. No moment where everything suddenly made sense in a flash. It came quietly, almost accidentally, on an ordinary afternoon that should have meant nothing. I was home alone, folding laundry in the living room, when my wife's tablet buzzed on the coffee table. She had left it behind in a rush that morning. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. We'd never been secretive with devices. Passwords were shared. Privacy was assumed, not guarded. The screen lit up with a notification preview. Just a name and a few words. Mark. Last night keeps replaying in my head. I froze. Literally stood there holding one of my kids' socks, my brain refusing to connect the dots. There had to be another explanation. A misunderstanding. A joke taken out of context. Anything other than what my chest was already tightening around. I told myself not to open it, that reading further would be crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But there's a moment when denial runs out of strength, when curiosity and fear overpower loyalty. My hands moved before my conscience could stop them. The thread opened easily. Too easily. There were messages stretching back weeks. Late-night texts, inside jokes I wasn't part of, complaints about feeling trapped, about how hard it is to pretend everything is normal, and then the lines that burned themselves into my memory, words of longing, of secrecy, of stolen moments, proof, undeniable and ugly, laid out in plain text. I sat down slowly, like my legs had forgotten how to work. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar, like I was sitting in someone else's life. Every sound, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, felt unbearably loud. In that moment, I realized something that hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't one bad decision. This was a choice they'd been making again and again, right under my roof, and I was the last one to know. I don't remember how long I sat there after that. Minutes, maybe an hour. Time stopped behaving normally. My thoughts came in waves, shock first, then a strange numbness, like my mind was trying to protect itself by shutting down anything too sharp. When the numbness cracked, the pain rushed in all at once. It was physical. My chest hurt. My stomach twisted like I'd been punched. I kept rereading the messages, even though each pass made it worse. Part of me was still looking for an out, some hidden explanation that would make this hurt less. There wasn't one. What hit me hardest wasn't just that my wife had cheated, it was who she'd cheated with. This wasn't some stranger. This was the guy who'd stood next to me at my wedding. The guy I trusted in my home, around my kids, around my life. Every memory I had with him suddenly felt contaminated, like it had been building toward this without me realizing it. Anger followed close behind. Hot, shaky anger that made my hands tremble. I wanted to throw something, to scream, to drive to Mark's place and demand answers I already had. Instead, I sat there in silence, staring at the floor, trying to breathe like a normal person. I thought about my kids, about how they'd laughed with Mark, how they hugged their mom every morning before school. The idea that their world might shatter because of this made my throat tighten. I wasn't just betrayed as a husband, I was betrayed as a father who believed his family was safe. When I heard my wife's car pull into the driveway, my heart started racing. I wasn't ready. There's no preparation for confronting the people who broke you while pretending everything was fine. But the truth was already out in the open, even if only in my hands. I stood up, wiped my face, and told myself one thing over and over. Whatever happens next, I will not pretend I didn't see this. When she walked through the door, she smiled like she always did, asked me how my day was, set her keys down in the same spot she always used. The normalcy of it all felt cruel, like the universe was mocking me for believing in it for so long. I didn't answer her at first. I just stood there, watching her move around the kitchen, humming softly, completely unaware or pretending to be that everything had already changed. My silence finally made her look up. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" she asked. I picked up the tablet and held it out to her. I didn't say his name. I didn't need to. The color drained from her face the second she saw the screen. In that moment, before she spoke, before she tried to explain, I knew everything I needed to know. Guilt has a way of announcing itself without words. She started crying almost immediately. Not loud sobs, quiet, panicked ones. She kept saying my name, over and over, like it was a lifeline. "It's not what you think," she said, which would have been almost funny if it didn't hurt so much. Then, "I didn't mean for this to happen. Then, I was going to tell you." Each sentence felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced them for the day she'd finally get caught. I asked her how long. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than the answer that followed. Long enough to lie to my face every day. I asked about Mark. She looked away, said it just happened, that they were both lonely, that they didn't plan it. I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't loneliness. This was intimacy built in secret, fed by deception. I told her to call him. Right then, my voice didn't sound like my own, flat, cold, controlled in a way that scared even me. She resisted at first, said it wasn't fair, said she needed time. I reminded her she'd already taken plenty of time. When Mark answered and heard my voice, there was a long pause. No denial, no confusion, just silence heavy enough to confirm everything. I told him to come over. He said, "I'm sorry," like that word could carry the weight of what he'd done. As I hung up the phone, I realized something that made my stomach drop even further. This conversation wasn't going to give me closure. It was only going to make the betrayal real in a way I couldn't escape anymore. Mark showed up about 20 minutes later. Those 20 minutes felt longer than the years I'd known him. My wife sat on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes red and swollen. I stayed standing. I needed the distance, the sense that I still had some control over my own body. When Mark walked in, he couldn't look at me. He mumbled another apology, staring at the floor like a kid caught cheating on a test. I almost wished he'd gotten angry, defensive, anything that would have made this simpler. Instead, he looked small, pathetic, and somehow that made it worse. I asked him how long. He glanced at my wife before answering, and that single look felt like another betrayal, like they were still sharing something I wasn't part of. "A few months," he said. The room went quiet. A few months of lies. A few months of smiles and dinners and pretending. I asked him why. Why her? Why my family? He said things that sounded hollow, and as they left his mouth, how he'd been going through a rough patch, how she understood him, how one thing led to another. My wife jumped in, saying it wasn't planned, that it was complicated. I stopped her mid-sentence. "There's nothing complicated about this," I said. "You both knew exactly what you were doing." The anger finally broke through then. My hands shook. My voice cracked. I told Mark to get out of my house. Not just leave the room, leave my life. He hesitated, like he wanted to say more, but there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. He walked out without looking back. When the door closed, the silence between me and my wife felt unbearable. She tried to touch my arm. I pulled away. The distance between us suddenly felt wider than the years we'd spent together. That night, I slept on the couch. Or at least, I tried to. Every time I closed my eyes, images I didn't ask for forced their way in. Them laughing, them together, my trust breaking apart in slow, vivid detail. I realized then that even if I wanted to forgive, I had no idea how to forget. The days that followed blurred together. We moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space. Careful, quiet, afraid of saying the wrong thing and setting off another explosion. My wife cried a lot, sometimes openly, sometimes behind closed doors. She kept apologizing, kept saying she loved me, that she wanted to fix this. Each apology landed differently. Some felt sincere, others felt desperate, like she was afraid of losing the life she knew more than she was afraid of losing me. I didn't know what I felt. Anger came and went in waves. Some moments I wanted to shout, to demand how she could do this to us. Other moments I just felt empty, like all the emotion had been drained out of me. Disappointment sat underneath everything, heavy and constant. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about realizing that a person I trusted most was capable of hurting me this deeply. At night, I replayed our entire relationship in my head, searching for signs I'd missed. I wondered if I'd failed her somehow, if I'd been too comfortable, too predictable. Then I hated myself for even thinking that way. Her choices were her own. Still, self-blame has a way of sneaking in when your world collapses. She asked me if I wanted counseling, if I wanted space, if I wanted her to leave for a while. Each question felt loaded, like there was a right answer I was supposed to know. The truth was, I was torn in half. Part of me wanted to cling to what we'd built, to believe that love and history could survive this. Another part of me felt something hardening inside, self-respect. Maybe, finally waking up. Our kids noticed the tension, even though we tried to hide it. They always do. Their quiet questions and worried looks cut deeper than any argument could. I told myself that, whatever decision I made, it had to be one I could live with and one that wouldn't teach them the wrong lesson about love. That's when I realized the real battle wasn't between me and my wife. It was inside me, between the man who wanted to forgive and the man who knew some lines change everything once they're crossed. I started taking long walks around town, usually late in the evening when most people were inside. This place had always felt safe, familiar. Now it felt too small, like the walls were closing in. Every street held a memory, dates, laughter, borrowed tools, shared beers. Everywhere I went, I saw ghosts of the life I thought I had. People noticed something was off. In the small town, silence itself becomes a signal. Friends asked if everything was okay. Coworkers said I looked tired. I nodded, said I was fine, kept moving. I wasn't ready to let the story belong to anyone else yet. It still felt too raw, too personal, like exposing it would make it real in a way I couldn't handle. At home, my wife tried to be patient. She gave me space, but hovered at the same time, always close enough to remind me she was still there. Sometimes she'd sit across from me at the table and talk about the past, good memories, milestones, moments she said proved we were worth saving. I listened, but it felt like she was describing a relationship that no longer existed. I thought about forgiveness more than I expected to, not because she deserved it, but because I needed to understand whether I could live without it. Forgiveness sounded noble, strong. Walking away sounded like failure. I wrestled with the idea that leaving meant throwing away years of shared history. Years that had once meant everything to me. But then there were moments, quiet, unguarded ones, when I felt a clear, sharp truth settle in. Trust isn't just hurt by betrayal, it's rewritten by it. Even if I stayed, I'd never be the same man in that marriage. I'd always wonder where she was, who she was texting, whether another secret was growing in the dark. One night, as I watched her sleeping from the doorway, I realized I wasn't angry in that moment. I was sad. Sad for what we were. Sad for what we could never be again. And sadness, I learned, can be just as decisive as anger. I knew then that a decision was coming. I just didn't know yet if I was strong enough to live with it. The breaking point came over something small. That's how it usually happens, I guess. Not a screaming match or another confession, just a quiet moment that finally made everything clear. She told me she'd run into Mark at the grocery store. She said it casually, like she was mentioning the weather. Then she rushed to explain that they didn't talk, that it meant nothing, that she wanted to be honest with me. I nodded, said nothing, and felt my chest tighten in a way that surprised me. The truth hit me all at once. Even the idea of them still being part of our world made me feel sick. This town wasn't big enough to erase him. I would see his truck, hear his name, pass his family, and every time, I'd be pulled right back into this moment, this pain. That night, I told her I needed her to leave for a while. The words came out steadier than I felt. She cried, asked if this meant it was over. I said I didn't know, which was the only honest answer I had. What I did know was that I couldn't think clearly with her there, couldn't hear my own thoughts over her apologies. When the door closed behind her, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sat at the kitchen table until morning, staring at the same spot on the wall, listening to the hum of the fridge. I expected relief. What I felt instead was grief. Real, deep grief for a life that had died without anyone holding a funeral for it. But underneath the grief was something else. A sense of clarity. For the first time since I'd found out, my thoughts felt like they belonged to me again. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. I realized that forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to be for me, not for the sake of keeping things the way they were. And keeping things the way they were was no longer an option. That was the night I accepted that love alone wasn't enough to save a marriage built on broken trust. The next few days were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Without my wife in the house, there was space, too much of it. Every room reminded me she was gone, but also reminded me why. I moved through the days on autopilot, doing what needed to be done for the kids, for work, for appearances. Inside, I was still sorting through the wreckage. She called and texted, careful not to push too hard. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I didn't. When we talked, the conversations were subdued, almost formal. She kept saying she was willing to do anything: counseling, transparency, cutting Mark out completely. I believed she meant it. That made this harder, not easier, because the question wasn't whether she could change. It was whether I could live with what had already happened. I tried to imagine staying. I pictured holidays, anniversaries, quiet evenings years from now. In every version, the betrayal was still there, sitting between us like an uninvited guest. I saw myself smiling while carrying a constant, low-level fear I'd never known before. I saw myself shrinking to make room for doubt. Then I imagined leaving. The loneliness scared me. The judgment scared me. Starting over in a town where everyone knows your history felt exhausting. But when I imagined my future without her, I also saw something else. Honesty, peace, the chance to rebuild myself without questioning my own worth every day. That realization didn't make the decision painless. It just made it inevitable. I understood then that staying wouldn't be an act of strength for me, it would be an act of self-betrayal. And I'd already had enough of that in my life. Making the decision wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slamming of doors, no cinematic confrontation. There was just me, sitting at the kitchen table one morning, staring at my coffee cup, realizing I had already made my choice in every quiet, painful way that had led me here. I called her and asked her to come over. When she arrived, she looked hopeful, maybe even relieved, like she thought this conversation would be a turning point. I hated that I had to be the one to deliver the truth she didn't want to hear. I've thought about this a lot, I said, keeping my voice calm, measured. I love you, and I always have. But I can't stay. I can't rebuild trust that's been broken like this. I've tried to imagine a future, and every time, the betrayal is still there. I'm choosing myself now. Her face fell. She tried to protest, to beg, to offer promises I wasn't ready to hear. I listened, quietly, letting her words wash over me. Each one was like a reminder of what we'd lost, but also confirmation of why I had to walk away. Then I told her I'd be moving out soon. She didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. There was no hatred in her expression, just sorrow, and maybe a hint of regret. I realized that part of love is letting go, even when it's devastating, when holding on would mean losing yourself. When the conversation ended, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. The life I thought I had was over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of freedom, a small sense that I could start to breathe again without carrying the weight of someone else's betrayal. Packing my things was harder than I expected, not because of clothes or personal items, but because of memories. Every drawer, every shelf, every little object reminded me of moments I'd shared with her, laughing in the kitchen, late-night talks, the first time we painted the nursery. Some of it felt sacred, and some of it felt poison now, tainted by betrayal. I kept the photos of the kids on the walls and packed the rest carefully. I didn't want to destroy everything. I just wanted to leave behind what belonged to a life that wasn't mine anymore. Walking through that house, room by room, I realized how much of myself I had invested in a marriage that, for a time, I believed was unbreakable. And now, that belief was gone. The hardest part was telling the kids. I didn't lie. I didn't hide the truth, but I tried to soften it, shield them from the pain of adult mistakes. Their faces, full of confusion and worry, broke me more than any confrontation with my wife ever could. I promised them that they were loved, that both their parents would still be there for them, and that none of this was their fault. Their little hands holding mine felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I still had something to fight for, even in the midst of my own heartbreak. As I left that house for the last time, I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that to survive, I had to keep moving forward. Every step away felt heavy, but also like a reclaiming of the life that betrayal had tried to steal from me. I drove in silence, listening to nothing, feeling the town shrink behind me. The streets, the familiar faces, even the quiet hum of my favorite grocery store, all of it would remind me someday. But for now, I needed the space to just be me again. And in that emptiness, I began to understand something I hadn't before. Leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes leaving is the only way to stay true to yourself. The weeks that followed were strange, disorienting, and, in some ways, liberating. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled faintly of fresh paint and loneliness. Nights were quiet, too quiet at first. The absence of her presence, of Mark's shadow in our lives, left a hollow space that echoed with memory. But slowly, I started to fill it with myself again. I cooked for the first time in years without worrying about anyone else's taste. I took walks and noticed things I hadn't before: the way the wind felt in the trees, the quiet corners of town that weren't part of our routine. I began to understand that life doesn't stop when betrayal happens. It just forces you to live differently. I still think about them, sometimes with anger, sometimes with disbelief, sometimes with a strange, painful nostalgia. I remember what it felt like to trust them, to laugh with them, to imagine forever together. And I remember, just as vividly, the betrayal, the sting of knowing those people I loved most had chosen each other over me. The hardest part wasn't the anger or the heartbreak, it was the trust I lost in myself. I doubted my judgment, my ability to read people, my capacity to protect the life I'd built. But time, as it always does, is patient. It teaches you that being hurt doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. And it reminds you that self-respect and honesty are worth more than comfort built on lies. I don't hate them. I just don't see a place for them in my future. I've accepted that love isn't enough when trust has been broken beyond repair. And somehow, even in the quiet aftermath of loss, I feel a tentative strength, a fragile kind of hope that life can still be good, even if it looks different than I ever imagined. I'm learning to forgive, not for them, but for me. To reclaim my life, my trust, my own sense of worth, and for the first time in months, I feel like maybe I can breathe again. Looking back now, I've learned more about love and trust than I ever wanted to in such a short, brutal span of time. Love alone isn't enough to hold a marriage together. Trust isn't just about faith in someone else, it's also about faith in yourself, in your instincts, in your ability to recognize when a line has been crossed. I've realized that betrayal isn't always dramatic or loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, slow enough to creep into the cracks of your life until you're standing on the edge, realizing the ground beneath you has shifted forever. And I've learned that walking away doesn't mean failure. Sometimes it means survival. Sometimes it's the only way to honor the years you gave, the lessons you learned, and the self-respect you refused to trade for comfort. I still love my kids fiercely, and I fight every day to show them what it means to hold onto integrity even when the people around you falter. I'm rebuilding a life that's mine, one day at a time, learning to trust again, not blindly, but carefully, intentionally, with the wisdom that heartbreak brings. And maybe the hardest, yet most important, lesson is this: some people can only teach you how strong you are by showing you how weak the foundation you trusted was. Betrayal doesn't define you. How you respond does. I'm not okay all the time. Some days are harder than others. But I am surviving, I am learning, and I am slowly, finally, finding myself again.